All right, so I want to tell you a story tonight, and I need you to stay with me on this one, because this story doesn't come with explosions. It doesn't come with missile strikes or market crashes or dramatic confrontations on the floor of Congress. This story arrives quietly. It arrives in the form of a phone call. A single phone call from the White House to a woman in Southwest Florida. And that phone call, what it represents, what it reveals, what it sets in motion may tell you more about the current state of American democracy than any headline you've read this month. Because what just happened in Florida's 16th congressional district is one of those moments that the political press covers as routine. Candidate announces, gives a speech, mentions grocery prices and conservative values, gets the endorsement, becomes the front runner, story over. Move on. But it's not routine. And if you look at what actually happened, if you trace the lines of power from the Oval Office to the RNC headquarters to a congressional district stretching from Tampa to Bradenton, what you find is not democracy in action. What you find is a machine, a placement machine, operating openly, operating efficiently, and operating with the full cooperation of every institution that is supposed to ensure that the people of Florida's 16th district get to choose their own representative. So let me walk you through it. All of it, the players, the mechanics, the context, and why this single congressional race in Southwest Florida is a window into something much larger and much more consequential than any one seat in any one state. Here's the setup. Vern Buchanan, longtime Republican congressman, has held this seat for nearly 2 decades, announced his retirement. That opens up a seat in a right-leaning district in a midterm year. In a political environment where Republicans are defending a House majority so razor-thin that the loss of a handful of seats flips control of the entire chamber, 218 to 214, that's the current breakdown. Republicans hold a 4-seat advantage, 4 in the entire United States House of Representatives, which means every open seat is a vulnerability. Every retirement is a risk. Every primary is a moment where something could go wrong, where a weak candidate could emerge, where a messy intra-party fight could leave the eventual nominee damaged heading into the general. The standard political approach to this situation, the approach that both parties have used for decades, is to let the local party infrastructure work. Let potential candidates emerge. Let them compete. Let the voters in the district evaluate their options and choose the person they believe best represents their community. The national party might weigh in with guidance, might steer resources, might signal preferences. But the decision ultimately belongs to the voters. That is not what happened here. What happened here is that Donald Trump, the President of the United States, personally called Sidney Gruters and urged her to run. 1 week later, she declared her candidacy. And she is now, by every credible political assessment, the prohibitive frontrunner. Not because she built a grassroots campaign, not because she spent months knocking on doors and earning support one voter at a time. Not because the people of Florida's 16th district looked at a field of candidates and decided she was the best option. Because the president told her to run. And in today's Republican Party, that's the only credential that matters. Now, who is Sidney Gruters? Let me give you the full picture. Because the full picture is where this story goes from interesting to alarming. She's the former executive director of the New College of Florida Foundation. She's a mother of 3. She's a resident of the district. And she is the wife of Joe Gruters. Joe Gruters is the chairman of the Republican National Committee. I'm going to let that sit for a moment, because I want you to process the institutional architecture of what's being constructed. The RNC chairman is the person who runs the Republican Party's national campaign infrastructure, fundraising, voter data, field operations, polling, message testing, strategic allocation of resources across every competitive House and Senate race in America. That is Joe Gruters' job. He decides or significantly influences where the party spends its money, which races get support, which candidates receive the benefit of the national party's data and organizing apparatus. And now his wife, personally recruited by the president that the RNC serves, is running for Congress. I want to be very precise about what I'm saying and what I'm not saying. I am not alleging that anything illegal has occurred. There is no law that prevents a president from endorsing any candidate he chooses. There is no law that prevents the spouse of a party chairman from running for office. Everything that has happened here is within the boundaries of what is technically permissible under American law, but legality and propriety are not the same thing. And what this arrangement creates structurally, perceptually, institutionally, is a concentration of power within a single family unit that now simultaneously occupies the presidency's inner circle, the party's national apparatus, and a seat in the United States Congress. The president selects the candidate. The candidate's husband runs the party infrastructure that supports candidates. The candidate enters Congress owing her seat not to the voters of her district, but to the president who placed her there and the party machinery her husband controls. That is a closed loop, and closed loops are the opposite of representative democracy. Now let me talk about the announcement itself, because the rhetoric she used and the gap between that rhetoric and the reality of how this candidacy came to exist is instructive. Sidney Gruder stood at a podium and said, and I'm going to quote her directly, "As a working mother of three, I see firsthand how much pressure rising prices are putting on families across Southwest Florida. From groceries and gas to housing and insurance, too many families, seniors, and veterans are being stretched thin. I'm running for Congress to protect our conservative values and fight for the people of this district." And you know what? She's right about the economics. She is absolutely right that families in Southwest Florida are struggling. Grocery prices are up, gas prices are up, housing costs in the Tampa-Bradenton corridor have skyrocketed. Insurance, particularly homeowners insurance, in a state battered by hurricanes has become genuinely unaffordable for many families. These are real problems affecting real people. But here's my question, and it's a simple one. If rising prices are the animating concern, if the economic pain of working families is the reason this candidacy exists, then why is the candidate being selected by the White House rather than by the working families, she says. She wants to represent, because the single mom in Bradenton who's choosing between groceries and insurance payments didn't call 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue and request Sidney Gruder's. The White House called Sidney Gruder's and told her to run. The direction of that phone call matters. It tells you where the accountability flows. It tells you who this representative will actually represent when the tough votes come. When the president wants something that isn't in the interest of that single mom in Bradenton, and that moment will come, it always comes. Whose call does this congresswoman take? The mom's or the president's? I think we both know the answer, and I think the president knows the answer too. That's why he made the call. Now, I need to zoom out, because looking at Florida's 16th district in isolation is like looking at a single pixel and trying to understand the whole image. The image only becomes clear when you step back and see the pattern. And the pattern, once you see it, is unmistakable. Let me connect the dots. Indiana. We covered this on the channel recently. The Trump White House pushed Indiana's Republican legislature to redraw the state's congressional map to maximize Republican advantage before the midterms. The state Senate, Republican-controlled, in a deep red state, voted it down. A rare act of legislative independence from members of the president's own party. Trump's response was not to accept the outcome, not to negotiate, not to move on. His response was revenge. 17 endorsements in Indiana state legislative races. 5 direct challenges to the Republican senators who voted no. Candidates brought to the White House. Photographed behind the Resolute desk. Millions of dollars from outside groups. The Club for Growth alone put in $1.5 million flooding into state Senate primaries that in any normal year would attract almost no outside attention or spending. The message to every Republican officeholder in Indiana, and by extension in America, was unambiguous. Vote against the president and we will end your career. That's the stick. Indiana is the stick. Now look at Florida, an open seat, a hand-picked candidate, the wife of the National Party chairman, recruited by presidential phone call, anointed before a single vote is cast. Cleared field, overwhelming front-runner status. The path to Congress paved and lit by the White House itself. That's the carrot. Florida is the carrot, stick and carrot, punishment and reward. Indiana and Florida, together they form a complete system of political control. Defy the president and face a funded, endorsed primary challenger backed by millions in outside spending. Serve the president and receive a cleared path, a personal endorsement, and the institutional backing of a national party apparatus that, in this case, quite literally is run by your family. When you see both of these operations running simultaneously, the purge in Indiana and the placement in Florida, you are not looking at normal political activity. You are not looking at a president engaging in the standard practice of supporting allies and opposing critics. You are looking at the systematic conversion of a political party into a patronage network, one in which advancement is determined not by voters, not by qualifications, not by policy expertise, not by community standing, but by proximity to and compliance with a single individual. And I want to be really careful here, because I know that every president tries to influence their party. Every president supports allies and campaigns against opponents. Every president uses the power of the office to shape the political landscape in their favor. That's not new. That's politics. But there is a difference, a categorical, structural, historically significant difference between a president who engages in politics and a president who engineers a party. Between a president who supports preferred candidates and a president who personally selects who will occupy seats in the legislature. Between a president who campaigns for allies and a president who constructs a system in which loyalty to him is the sole qualification for public office and disloyalty is a career death sentence. That line has been crossed. Indiana and Florida are the proof. And the implications don't stay in those states. They radiate outward to every Republican primary in the country, to every Republican incumbent deciding whether to exercise independent judgment or fall in line, to every potential candidate weighing whether to run on their own merits or wait for the phone call from Washington. And the implications are compounded by the razor-thin House majority, because 4 means that every member of the Republican caucus has genuine leverage. In a majority this narrow, any small group of members can block legislation, demand concessions, force negotiations. That's how slim majorities are supposed to work. They force consensus. They empower individual members. They create a legislature where the president has to persuade rather than dictate. But that structural empowerment only matters if members are willing to use it. And if the cost of using it, the cost of exercising independent judgment, of demanding concessions, of occasionally saying no, is a Trump-backed primary challenger funded by millions in outside money, then no rational actor will use their leverage. The 4-seat majority becomes not a check on presidential power, but a rubber stamp for it. A majority so disciplined by fear and reward that it functions not as an independent legislative body, but as an extension of the executive branch. That is what's being built. And it's being built in the open, in Indiana, in Florida, and in every state where the president's endorsement has become the only primary that matters, the primary before the primary, conducted not by voters, but by the White House. Now, let me address something that I know some people watching this are thinking. They're thinking, so what? This is how parties work. Strong leaders shape their parties. Winners get to call the shots. If Trump's candidates win their primaries, then voters have validated his choices. That's democracy. And I understand that argument. I do. But I want to push back on it. Because there's a difference between voters choosing a candidate who happens to have the president's endorsement because they've evaluated that candidate and decided they're the best option, and voters choosing a candidate because the president's endorsement has made the race uncompetitive before it starts. When millions of dollars flood into a state legislative primary, as they have in Indiana, the playing field is not level. The incumbents being challenged are not being defeated by better candidates. They're being drowned by money. When the president personally recruits a candidate and that candidate immediately becomes the prohibitive frontrunner, as in Florida, the primary is not a competition, it's a coronation. Democracy requires meaningful choice. It requires that voters have genuine options and genuine information. When the outcome is predetermined by presidential decree and institutional money, the form of democracy persists, the ballots exist, the voting booths are open, the results are tabulated, but the substance is hollowed out. You're voting, but you're not choosing. The choice was made for you, in the Oval Office, on a phone call you weren't party to. And look, I want to acknowledge something about Sidney Gruder specifically. She may be an excellent candidate. She may be deeply qualified. She may genuinely care about the issues she raised in her announcement. I have no reason to believe otherwise. People who know her speak well of her. Her experience at the New College Foundation is legitimate professional experience. Her concerns about the cost of living in Southwest Florida are shared by virtually every resident of that district. But that's not the point. The point is not whether this particular candidate is good or bad. The point is the process by which she was selected. The point is that the President of the United States is personally choosing who occupies seats in the legislative branch, the branch that is constitutionally designed to check executive power, and he is doing it through a mechanism that bypasses the democratic process while technically operating within it. The Constitution doesn't prohibit this. No law prevents it. But the founders designed a system based on the assumption that the executive and legislative branches would maintain a degree of independence from each other. That tension, that productive, necessary, structurally vital tension, is what prevents the concentration of power that the entire American system was built to resist. And what we're watching in Indiana and Florida and in the endorsement patterns across the country is the systematic elimination of that tension. Not through constitutional amendment, not through legal reform, through patronage, through the president's ability to determine who enters the legislature and, by extension, how they vote once they get there. Let me bring this back to the broader context, because this is not happening in a vacuum. It's happening while this president faces the most challenging political environment of his career. Approval ratings at historic lows. The base eroding 21 points among white non-college men in Fox News polling. A trade war with Canada that's backfiring economically. An Iran conflict that's escalating militarily. Congressional Republicans beginning to calculate that the midterms could be catastrophic. In that environment, when the external pressures are mounting, when the public is turning skeptical, when the policy failures are accumulating, the instinct to control the party becomes not just a preference, but a survival mechanism. If you can't control the economy, control the caucus. If you can't control the polls, control the primaries. If you can't make the country follow you, make sure the people who represent your party have no choice but to follow you. That's what Indiana and Florida represent. Not political strategy in the conventional sense. Institutional self-preservation. The construction of a legislative branch so thoroughly dependent on presidential favor that it will not serve as a check on presidential power, regardless of what the polls say, what the economy does, or what the voters want. And the timing matters, because the midterms are approaching. And if the House majority is at risk, if the 4-seat margin is genuinely threatened, then the members who survive the midterms, the ones who hold their seats, will be disproportionately those who owe their positions to presidential endorsement and institutional money. The independent voices, the ones who might have exercised judgment, might have demanded accountability, might have served as a check, will have been purged, either defeated in primaries or frightened into compliance. The Congress that emerges from this process will not be the Congress the founders envisioned. It will be a Congress shaped by one man's preferences, populated by his chosen loyalists, and structurally incapable of performing its constitutional function as a co-equal branch of government. That's what a phone call to Sidney Gruters means. That's what 17 endorsements in Indiana mean. That's what millions of dollars in state legislative primaries mean. It means the machinery is being assembled, piece by piece, race by race, endorsement by endorsement. And the voters, the actual people who are supposed to be making these decisions, are being presented with the illusion of choice, while the choice itself was made months ago in a room they'll never enter, on a call they'll never hear. So here's what I want to leave you with tonight. Pay attention to the primaries, not just the general elections, not just the big Senate races and the swing district House contests that get national coverage. Pay attention to the state legislative races in Indiana. Pay attention to the open seat congressional race in Florida. Pay attention to every race where the president has personally intervened to select or oppose a candidate, because that's where the real election is happening. Not in November, now, in the primaries, in the endorsements, in the phone calls, in the meetings behind the resolute desk. And if the pattern holds, if the Indiana purge succeeds and the Florida placement succeeds and the message is received by every Republican office holder in America, then by the time November arrives, the outcome will already be determined, not by voters, by the machine. If you want to keep tracking this, every endorsement, every primary, every dollar, every race where presidential power is being converted into legislative control, subscribe right now. Hit the notification bell. Share this with someone who cares about how their representatives are actually chosen, because the story of American democracy in 2026 is not being written in Washington. It's being written in Indiana and Florida and in every district where a phone call from the White House has replaced a conversation with the voters. And once that replacement is complete, getting it back is a lot harder than losing it. Talk soon.